Welcome to Wiser Dialogue, conversations with women of color about issues, policies, and research that impact our lives. On this episode, our guests are Michelle Holder, Assistant Professor of Economics at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, Valerie Johnson, the Mott Distinguished Professor of Women's Studies and Director of Africana Women's Study at Bennett College, and Deirdre Cooper, Associate Professor of History at Queens College. Welcome, ladies.
Thank you.
As we come up on Black History Month, I wanted to have a conversation about some of the myths associated with Black women that we hear, or the ways in which Black women are ignored more broadly in the economy. So I want to start with one that was sort of on my nerves, and it was about the education of Black women. And so there was this conversation that Black women were the most educated group of any women, which I thought, first of all, we're only 7% of the population, so folks should have known that that was not true. And what that stats really is that Black women earn more of the bachelor's degrees when you're looking at Blacks. So I'll start with you, Michelle. What's a myth that you've been hearing that, you're just like, please stop?
Yeah, so I'm just going to link it into some research that I'm going to be undertaking. So one of the things that I've really been wrestling with is this notion about Black women. And so we all recall the 1990s, right, where you had this myth about the Black women and the welfare queen, and Black women aren't hardworking. Mm-hmm. And when in fact, corporate profitability in the United States has a lot to do, and a debt that is owed specifically to Black women, because given the gender wage gap and the race wage gap, it's really Black women who disproportionately provide, their productivity to corporate America, and they aren't remunerated in kind. So corporate America, in part, owes its profitability, its riches, in other words, in part to Black women. So, and the other thing is, and us around this table know this, but we really have to keep repeating it, of all the demographic groups, Black women are really, of all the female demographic groups, I should say, Black women are the most attached to the labor force, given our labor force participation rate. So somehow, that myth that emerged in the 70s, 80s, and 90s about Black women, not being hardworking, has no basis in reality.
You offer a good point in terms of the profitability of corporate America being on the backs of Black women. And I think that ties very nicely to the work that Deirdre has done around the medical profession.
Hey, it's really interesting to talk about these myths. And so a part of it is a myth around Black women not feeling pain, particularly in terms of reproduction or childbirth. And so although I look at enslaved women, a part of the myth comes around the fact Black women seemed physically stronger because they were always working. They were always a part of a labor force. And so when you're doing manual labor, where you're chopping sugar cane or cropping tobacco or picking cotton, hundreds of pounds of a raw product, you're going to build muscular development. But what that also does when you're pregnant is it puts you more at risk, right? And so a part of this notion that Black women are stronger physically, emotionally, as if we're medical super bodies, the term that I coined in my book, really shows how people are not attuned to the kinds of dangerous work that Black women have been doing for centuries in this country. And so the kind of 21st century, consequence of Black women's bodies literally being broken down by labor, both productive and reproductive, is that, in fact, we become more frail. We are at risk. We are a vulnerable population. And so that leads to higher maternal morbidity rates and also infant morbidity rates around this notion. And so for me, it was about looking at the past, these enslaved women whose bodies had literally helped to develop American modern gynecology, not just as patients, but also looking at them as contributors, because many of these doctors were forcing them to also work as nurses while they were in fact being experimented on. And so they were never, ever divorced from labor. And so if there's one thing I can push, is to really dismantle this notion that Black women are stronger, because it's literally killing us and also the babies that we bear.
And I like that. I think that's a great point, that we are stronger. And I also, like how you and Michelle are both talking about the attachment to the workforce, even if it's not paid labor, but attachment to work, which brings us to what Valerie, the work that Valerie has done and Black women in the church. So Valerie, would you talk a little bit about your research and the church?
So my research stems from questions I had about the church supper and the whole idea of how we organize and execute the church supper. And the answer to the question about whether it's labor or not has to do with the idea of tithing. So partly the reason they're saying it's not volunteer work is because it is our duty and responsibility as members of the church to contribute to the church. And so there's that kind of separation that can occur. So I looked at the meals prepared mostly by the women in the church, and that it gave them also expertise that they would take outside of the church and build businesses with. So for example, you have the woman who makes these fabulous cakes, and sometimes she gets the moniker, the cake lady. Taking that and then putting that into an entrepreneurial place is different, though. If you were to, when I asked or talked about it, they just saw it as kind of, well, yes, people were asking me if I would make this cake for this occasion and this cake for that occasion, and I would charge a little something. Mm-hmm. But to see it as business is a different step and another kind of growth. So I was really interested in making more deliberate links between what you're doing in the church with these church suppers that are being prepared, and they come up regularly, and then what was happening or still happening outside of that church space, that sacred space in the secular world, and that those connections are really important. The other part and piece to all of this also stemmed from my anger. That would be the best place to put it. My anger about how Black women's contributions to American cuisine just drops off the radar.
Yes.
We just, they're just cooks. And it's minimalized and made not to be as important as the chefs who develop these cuisines. But when you look at the kinds of meals that are prepared, the foods that come into the American diet, and the various preparation of those foods, you see back there Black women. And this is a personal thing for me because I learned how to cook and learn my family history through my mother telling me the stories of her grandmother, Miss Kizzy, who's Gullah Geechee. And so making those kinds of links and contacts. So the other piece of the work that I do, besides collecting cookbooks that have been written by Black people, male, female, whatever, is also to maintain sort of that archive of how we contribute, what we've done in the food ways.
Well, I think that sort of a common theme in all of our myths is again the ways in which Black women the contribution of Black women have been ignored. But I do want to go back to the Black girl magic, because it is something that I have been thinking about to the point that I was like, let me go look up this word magic, because I am concerned about that term Black girl magic, because what it implies is that there is something supernatural about what we do.
Also means that it denies the kind of knowledge that we've acquired and the work that has gone into having this wealth of knowledge. So that magic seems to be more easy in a way that there's little effort. If you're magic, you're imbued with this talent and just things can just happen. Mm-hmm. And I understand the move of Black girl magic, but I resist it because I also remember our histories of being magical Negroes and people rubbing people's heads to get luck, and the ways in which we are created into objects. And so that pushback from magic is, for me, a pushback from being objectified and reclaiming our subjectivity.
So in terms of policy, do you all have recommendations for public policy, whether it's national or just things within our communities?
Big question you're asking, because I can think of different things, but I'll defer first to, I think, Michelle.
You know, there's been this debate around the minimum wage for the last several years, and so much so that some states, actually several states, have undertaken to increase their own state minimum wage, right? Because either if you live in a particular state, if that state has a state minimum wage, and it's higher than the federal minimum wage, that's the wage you're entitled to. So my point is that I think when we talk about increasing the minimum wage, what we miss in there is the impact on Black women. Because we have to understand, the minimum wage doesn't just affect families, it affects women disproportionately. Women disproportionately are minimum wage laborers in the US, and certainly among that would be Black women. So coming from the labor perspective and the workforce perspective and making sure that women are paid equitably, we need to move the needle at the national level on the minimum wage, because $7.25 an hour is just no way to support a family. And so I would like to see, that taken up, because states should not be the sole bearer of making sure people and women are paid a decent wage.
And Michelle, I would chime onto that, not just a family. Sometimes it's challenging when it's a family of one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think that is part of the conversation that is always problematic for me. As, if you are a single person, no one thinks about, and I know no one is strong, but the conversation about my household and what's necessary to make sure that my household is healthy and whole is not part of the conversation.
And I'm thinking, and this may be just the wish list, broad policy, is that when we craft various kinds of policies to do the real hard analysis that goes to your point about diversity, inclusion, how does this differentially impact these communities of color, communities of disabled? Because we get these blanket policies and then they don't really service but a small segment, but we'll say, oh, well, it's covering women. How is it covering women? Which women are you talking about and where? So that would be my interjection. And it also dovetails into the idea around medical education and talking about how do we keep perpetuating the myths of the Black people being so impervious to pain, or that we can take all of these different pain episodes. So my idea is, how do we shore up those kind of education? Is Deidre's book a part of medical education? Full stop, across the board. So,
well, I have some great news. I've been in conversation with medical professionals, particularly a Black OBGYN who was literally about to leave the field, becomes a MPH and is now finishing up a PhD program. But we've been in talks about really having this book as a part of a module for medical schools.
Wow.
For doulas, for midwives, because what I found in my conversations with medical practitioners on the ground, they didn't know. And so for them, understanding that the very structure of American medicine, not just gynecology, but so many branches of American medicine, is tied up, it's bound up with white supremacy, period. That's
absolutely
important to change the curriculum around that, so that we don't have students graduating from supposedly high-ranking schools like UVA and the University of Chicago's medical school And they're coming away with 19th century ideas about pain management and whether Black people have thicker skin or thicker blood. I mean, just things that I thought people had discarded, over a century ago, and they're still perpetuating these myths. So for me, if I had a policy issue, it would be the medical education needs to change. Two, during well women's exams, the first time I saw the inside of my body is when I was undergoing diagnostic testing for IVF. I was over 40 at that time. For the first time in my life, it was the only time I'd seen my uterus, fallopian tubes.
Wow.
That's not something that women get to see, right? So the doctor gets to see your internal body, right? Your internal reproductive body. The nurse gets to see it, but you don't. So we have no idea what our bodies look like. And so that should be a part of a well women's exam. The only time the medical industry tends to respond to women's health concerns is when white women are impacted, which is now why we have pap smears, because white women were being disproportionately affected by cervical cancer. The reason why we are told to get mammograms is because white women were disproportionately affected by breast cancer. And so for me, it would be incorporating a much more inclusive way of examining our bodies. And then lastly, holding hospitals accountable for the shabby, brutal, and inhumane treatment that they give to patients of color, especially around reproductive care. Black women get more C-sections. Our expectant mothers are dying either during childbirth or during the postpartum period in greater numbers. And even for states that have very small Black populations, Black people still tend, and Native women, but Black people in particular still have higher numbers of either childbirth, childbirth deaths and illnesses. And this is an epidemic, right, that the reproductive justice and the birthing justice system has been talking about for decades. And there's no policy change around it.
So with that, ladies, I'm going to ask that we're going to wrap this up. I so appreciate your time. Again, want to thank my guest, Michelle Holder, Assistant Professor of Economics at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, Valerie Johnson, the Mott Distinguished Professor of Women's Studies and Director of Africana Studies at Bennett College, and Deirdre, I'm going to get your name right this time, and Deirdre Cooper Owens, Associate Professor of History at Queens College. You have been watching Wiser Dialogue, The Missing Viewpoint.